How's everybody doing? Good? There we go. Okay, cool. All right, I want to make sure I didn't get like a completely like comatose crowd from lunch. I'm super excited to talk about this today because I'm like really passionate about it. When I first joined Edge, the first feature I got to be a part of implementing was responsive images. And I pushed really hard for it. It actually wasn't even on the roadmap at the time because I just left building a website where we needed responsive images and it was a pain. About that same time, responsive images were kind of coming to a close, and the next issue that people really wanted to talk about were container queries. And that's kind of what I'm really excited to talk about today. When I first kind of pitched this to PPK and kind of told people that it was accepted, Amelia Billamy-Rhodes, SVG working group, asked me, is this going to be a why we can't have nice things talk? There are enough of those. I actually point to a few of those within this talk. We'll quickly cover the landscape, but like as web developers, it's great to always talk about the hypotheticals, the futures, what could be, what can be. But I actually wanted to talk about because I get the benefit of working on the CSS aspect of the rendering engine, I get to meet with a lot of large companies, both internal and external to Microsoft, and they a lot of times want to solve container queries, and some of the solutions that we've come up to solve that. And so that's the main premise of this talk. Each of them have pros and cons, and we'll look at all of those. So let's just go ahead and jump right in. So for those of you that aren't aware of what container queries are, why do web developers want it? We end up wanting to change layout. We want to change styles based on our container size, style computation, typography. Kind of the use cases are kind of endless. A lot of us are used to doing responsive web design, and in this scenario, when the browser resizes, you notice the inner blue box changes to a yellow. Container queries kind of flip this on its head, and instead of the browser resizing, when the container resizes to a certain point, we want to achieve the same end result. That, in essence, is container queries. A real-life example of this, I love this. This is native Outlook, and you can see I'm actually just resizing the toolbar on the left, and the navigation is responding accordingly, and then once it gets to a certain size, it gets smaller. If that's kind of hard to see, I kind of put it in graphical terms with crazy, terrible-looking colors so that it would resize, and then once it gets down there, it resizes accordingly. Currently, that's kind of complicated to solve. The responsive issues community group initially went in with something like this. This is the syntax. They were like, hey, we're going to go div when it's a min width of 800 pixels. We want you to compute these styles. Quickly, a problem was pointed out that technically this resolves to true initially, but then within it we make it so it's false. And most of us here can probably see the recursion problem of this. So then people went back to the drawing board and were like, effectively what we're trying to solve is media queries, but on a container. So what we'll do is we'll come up with a syntax that's effectively similar, and we'll call it container queries, so that we're looking at its containing block or some ancestor, rather than the actual element that we're changing. So if it looks like app media, why won't it work? So let's understand the problem space. Eric Portis, he's a good like internet friend of mine. We've talked since about 2014 about container queries on and off again numerous times. He gave a talk at Smashing Conf that goes into this in great detail. I highly recommend you go watch it. But I love this graphic because it kind of shows the rendering pipeline and what it does. And you can see we end up with the DOM tree, we cascade compute styles, we end up with a box tree, we lay out, position them, and then we finally render the pixels to the tree. Understanding the rendering engine completely is not the point of this graphic. The important aspect of it is noting that it goes in one direction. Every single browser architecture, I don't care if it's Blink, Gecko, WebKit, Edge, all of them have an implicit rule that leaving one aspect of one of these aspects of the engine and go into the other takes the input of the previous section's output. In container queries, in order to actually do it, in the previous example, we were looking at 800 pixels, which is this fixed width. In most scenarios with responsive web design, they're not fixed. So in order for us to actually answer this, we have to do it after layout. And this breaks that fundamental rule. And that is why container queries, currently in the current proposals, and it's worth noting most of these are just kind of like pseudocode, are just not possible. If you want to understand the rendering engine more in depth, on this stage 2 years ago, I actually gave a talk called Braces to Pixels that takes all of your CSS. It gives you from parsing all the way to rendering and then validation, and helps you understand why that's hard for us to do within the engines and the architectures that we have. So let's start on actual ways of solving this today. We're going to start off with a good old iframe. I'm sure some people will kind of roll their eyes at this and kind of, squeam a little bit because of the fact it's an iframe. That said, it's still a very valuable approach. If we go back to the media queries from earlier, most of us use them in the default document. And so this ends up resolving against the viewport because that's the initial containing block. And that's actually the reason that we can even do media queries, is because it's a constant that we can resolve at computation time. Using iframes, it's actually a replaced element. It's similar to when you heard Eric's talk this morning with the select controls. It's actually a replaced element at which it already has a min and max content size by default, whether you size it or not. And so we can then just as well resolve media queries against that. So in order to make this work, all we have to do is remove the border, set its width, height, so that it basically fills its container. And now all the media queries within that iframe are actually resolving against its actual container. And so that makes it work exactly like in a lot of the scenarios we actually want it to work like. So I want to introduce you here to Madeline. It's the cow in the rowboat. I'll go over why there's a cow in a rowboat a little bit later. But this is using iframes, and I have custom properties within this SVG. And effectively, all Madeline wants to be able to do is row this rowboat during the day rather than at night. So when we click this button, it changes just the container, and you see that we have achieved our end result. Here's a more practical example of a nav where the container shrinks, and we end up showing like a ... where the nav menus would then be within them. This is not unlike the Outlook example we showed at the very beginning. It's again one of those things where in doing this talk and in numerous interactions with partners, it's always important to understand what your use case is. And in so many of the container query scenarios, people are very contextual and it's very specific on what they want to query on. And usually it's not just the width. So the pros and cons of iframes, since most of us are kind of accustomed to them, I didn't want to spend too much time there. But the pros, it works exactly, I think, how most of us would expect it. The biggest con of iframes is they can't contribute the content size to their containers. That is the biggest fallback. So if you end up with something where you only care about one dimensionality, iframes are actually a completely reasonable scenario. The other few options that I have there due to manageability, custom properties, all those things, those are easy to tool away, especially with like iframe source stock existing. We could easily tool all of this away to make it so that these work. Your custom properties, you could put in a shared style sheet and use across iframes in different components. Modern layout. I'm actually really thrilled. The talk earlier that was talking about web design covered a lot of modern layouts, so I don't have to spend too much time here. But this is another one where when we initially started about container queries, we didn't necessarily have everything that the platform has today. And so there's quite a few container query scenarios that actually are already solved. So Dave Rupert has this great quote where he was trying to create a faux grid with Css Flexbox, and he refactored 50 lines of Flexbox grid into just roughly 5 lines of CSS grid. And the best part, he didn't use any media queries. And while that's great, it's a great quote, let's look at a realistic example. Jonathan Snook actually happens to be in the audience today, and he did all the hard work for me, which was great, because then I didn't have to do it. But this is a common one. You have blog posts, you have shopping items, you have some type of card setup. And when the content shrinks down, you want it to wrap, you want it to look a little bit different. Basically, imagine responsive images, except for based on the container. Let's say you take the same layout and you put it into a container on the side. You want it to behave like media queries, breakpoints. And as you see in this video, as we resize down, the layout completely changes. There's no media query breakpoints in this at all. We achieved all of that with that one line of grid template columns. This was spoken about earlier, but what we're using is auto placement and auto sizing. And so what ends up happening is we're using this repeat syntax and auto fit and auto fill keywords, and then we're setting a min-max range of 400 pixels to 1 FR. Sarah Sweden, who spoke just before me, which works out really well, has a great example here of the difference between autofit and autofill. I made one slight adjustment to it to make it a little bit more clear of what is actually happening here. But autofill is actually taking those dimensions that end up being calculated and putting in as many tracks as possible. And what autofit does, it says, hey, technically you only have 7 items, so I'm just going to drop all the ones that have nothing in them and collapse them down, and then I'm going to distribute the remaining space to those items. So if we go back to Jonathan's example here, he has a min-max of 400 pixels. So depending on the dimensionality of the container, again, no viewports taken into account here, of the container, it sets up a range of 400 pixels to whatever that may be of the distribution space. So with this one line of grid, we actually end up with 3 completely different layouts based on its container, because that's how grid and flex just inherently work. they're going to size themselves based on what you've defined at the container level. There's also another aspect that he takes into account here, which is object fit color, which, while in essence isn't specifically container query based, it does give you complete control over how images are sized relative to their container of the replaced element. To make this a little bit more clear, I use PlaceKitten. If you don't use PlaceKitten, use PlaceKitten for all of your image needs. But it takes 5 different values. And you can see the initial one, that's actually what the image looks like. It's actually a 300 by 300 image. I resized all the boxes. This is actually just a flex set of images here that I made 200 by 300. And then you can see the different values, what ends up happening. Fill basically doesn't maintain aspect ratio and squishes them all down. Contain maintains the aspect ratio and makes sure it fits. Scale down does either none or contain, whichever is smaller. So in this case, it's doing contain. And then cover maintains the aspect ratio and scales it up until it completely covers the box's dimensions. So it allows you to achieve a good image result with knowing the actual container size without needing to do any JavaScript swapping or anything of that matter. I've actually been working on my personal website. I actually have a new subsection I probably won't post. Family's been going through some stuff, but I was able to do some cool things with object fit. This is my daughter, Rachel. And so the important aspect, and this is where I go back to container queries, are usually very specific. I actually don't care that you see the entire picture of Rachel here. What I care is that you see her smile. And so this is a grid layout, and I'm using object fit cover. And so as you see, as I resize the box down here, you'll see that it maintains the aspect ratio that I need. And then you'll see when I resize up, again, all the layout stays exactly as I would want it to. Nice, crisp, beautiful, easy to read, all that good stuff. And so it's really, really a powerful, rich capability that allows us to do something that we weren't able to do even 3 or 4 years ago. So the pros and cons to this. The pros, there's a lot of wonderful browser support for this. One of the major cons is it can't do content changes or style changes. If you're looking for a container query solution that is solely layout-based, look to Grid and Flexbox first, because a lot of those scenarios can actually be solved. Granted, you have to switch your mental model. This is something that I noticed while working on so many of these demos, my brain wants to think media query width is 500 pixels. And what's so interesting about it is so often we pick that 500 pixels, but we actually don't know, especially, I don't know how many people here work where they actually work on something that's a CMS and they don't know what content's gonna fit within it. Okay, a good majority of us. That's what I did as well. So it was a lot of building sites like that. And so we pick, okay, well this is 500 pixels, but we don't even know what content's going in there. So we end up saying, okay, this width needs to be 500 pixels, and thus we're gonna change the layout when we may not actually even need to change the layout. And by using these modern techniques, it automatically takes your container into account. So I highly recommend looking at this. I'm about to get a little bit more technical with you, and hopefully you know some JavaScript, but we're gonna move on to get bounding client rect. So we'll take a very simplistic scenario. We have this 100 pixel square. We're gonna enlarge it to 200 pixels. And then after it gets beyond 100 pixels, we want it to change to green. The only thing that is occurring is we have a grid layout here, and when you click that button, I add a class of enlarge, and all it's doing is it's changing the columns and rows. That's the only thing that's occurring. In order to accomplish this within JavaScript, we're using request animation frame to iterate over top of this, and what we end up doing is if that dimensionality, we save it in a temporary variable, so if it's the same, we go ahead and bail. If it's a different one, we go ahead and check it against the dimensions, and then we set the styles accordingly. Here's this running. You can see it works. But like I said, I want us to have all the information. Just knowing that we can do it is not enough. So what I did is I went ahead and threw in a console.log to track essentially how many times we're doing this, and I didn't even track all of them. A lot. We're running this code over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, because RAF, essentially what it means is every single time that the browser ends up needing to go paint to the screen, it's executing this code. So the pros, it's widely supported for get bounding client rect. It can solve any type of scenario that you end up needing to do. It runs on every RAF is a huge con. It needs the developer to do a lot of the wiring for you. So you end up needing to wire up a lot more stuff. So if you end up wanting to know the offsets of different boxes, you have to wire all that up. So Resize Observer. This is the next evolution of get bounding client rect. So we're trying to achieve the exact same end result, but you'll notice here that all we end up doing is passing in that div, and we're saying to observe it. I don't know how many people here have used Mutation Observers. This works very similar in manner. So what we end up doing is we pass in element or elements that we wish to observe, and then we iterate over top of these entries, and we're passed interesting information about them. And so what we end up doing, there's a new object that hangs off of this entry, and it's got contact rect.width is greater than 100. We go ahead and do that style thing before. Jake Archibald, a good friend of mine, he actually is a F1 race reviewer that happens to work on the Chrome team. He gave a wonderful events talk. I highly recommend going and watching it. This middle circle here represents the main thread. This one over here is JavaScript, and over there is the main pipeline. And the white area in between is actually the CPU going and doing some work. So we'll watch it just do its thing for a second. So it's going and doing tasks, come back around, doesn't necessarily have anything to work, goes executes the tasks again. Hey, now it can go run RAF style layout in Paint, and move on, go execute the other task before. This is important because of the fact of how Resize Observer works. So we created that observer, and this is why it's kind of cool. This is why I get kind of excited about it, is because of the fact that when we go into layout, you have now asked to watch that div. And so now that you've asked to watch that div, we notice that it changed. And before, when you were watching the get bounding client rect, we ended up having to, hey, we have to go ask that div, what is your size, which may or may not already be cached, may invalidate layout again to answer said question, depending on how high up the tree you're watching. But it then passes you all this information right off the bat, because we just did layout for it. So it passes you over, sets up the task, and passes this into your task, which you then can iterate on using entry and values. Again, to understand kind of how much it's executing, I added the same console log. I didn't even need a video for this one, it's just an image. And essentially you can see that it's got the initial layout, and then once we click the button. So one of the major negatives of this one is the support is kind of lacking. Effectively, Chrome is the only one that has that. There's actually very good reasons for this, though. The polyfill is here. It works perfectly fine. Basically, it's going to fall back to that get bounding client rect scenario that I was talking about before. I highly recommend, Eric did a good job of talking about how you all can get involved. Use stuff. Use it in production, please. Go use the polyfill. One of my pet projects is I run a crawler basically to get data on the web so that I can understand what's being used, and we actually run every browser. So please, use stuff, because we're kind of watching that to see how much it's actually used. The pros of it is it allows any CQ scenario, so any container query scenario. It works with the platform again, because essentially what container queries are trying to do is they're wanting to watch some event. And this already bakes into events that we already support and already work with the rest of the platform. One of the biggest benefits of this is it's only called when necessary. So if you really want that at media query, this div is a width, then this is only going to fire when that thing has been resized, and then you can interrogate. The cons, it requires you to know that, hey, I want this box to be 100 pixels in order to change. Whereas the modern layout ones, remember, we didn't technically need to know the widths, we just needed to know what type of layout we wanted. And as long as we set it up in such a way that it did that, the container could be whatever size, we didn't need to care. Another negative, and I will probably ping them now that I'm giving a talk about this, I'll ping them again. It's an unofficial draft spec. I've asked a few times for it to be promoted to the CSS working group, but it is still sitting in the WICG. And obviously the con of browser support that I went over earlier. I plan to spend a little bit more of my time here with Intersection Observer. I've been in numerous meetings about container query-based approaches, and one of the most common ones that we had was block ellipsis. I'll actually show you that in a little bit. But Intersection Observer is actually really unique. Most people, who here has heard of Intersection Observer? Real quick. Okay, a few hands. Usually it's pitched like this, because this is actually how it was sold to us when we first had it. Google came and said, hey, ad networks suck, I guess, and they're really slow. And the reason why is because a lot of the people that are putting their ads on there actually want to track themselves. They want to track to see whether or not they're visible. So what we need to do is we need to put in the platform some way for them to do that, but do it in a performant manner. much similar to container queries. We want to do it, but how do we enable it to be performant? And so enter intersection observer. And so by default, what you end up with is the viewport is your root. And then you end up saying, observing just like Resize Observer, you end up picking containers that you want to observe. And then when they intersect that, it lets you know all kinds of information. So in this scenario, using the reason why it came up with, we're going to act like we're watching these ads. And so we can say, hey, this one's intersecting. Sweet, it's fully visible. We scroll down, hey, this one's fully visible. But we don't actually care about ads because we're trying to do container queries. I put this in here because so many of the meetings that I would end up in with different companies, I think we're so used to responsive web design from 2010, when it was first introduced, I believe, roughly around that time frame, that we're so used to at media query this width, that's how we expect everything to work. And so it's one of those scenarios where we are now also, a lot of us using React, Vue, we're building design systems, so we're very much at the component level. And so we're thinking, hey, you know, when this component resizes within its container, I want it to do something. And so we really want to query on that width for that specific component, but we always need to take into account the totality. So do we actually really care about the width? In many of the scenarios, I actually would posit that correlation does not equal causation. And I'm sure that there's some statisticians and mathematicians here that are like, wow, Greg, you're overloading that. But that's okay, because it makes my point. Because if we go back to this scenario, do we actually care about the width of the nav? No, we don't. The actual problem is the fact that the nav items down at the bottom are beginning to truncate at such a point that the user experience is bad. We actually don't care how big that thing was. We just care about the problem that it's essentially overflowing. That's all we care about. If there's only one item there, we no longer care about the width, right? That's the actual problem. We just happen to only, up until this point, only have width to trigger on using media queries. So using Intersection Observer, down below, it's very similar to Resize Observer. We set up a new Intersection Observer callback. Right now, we're just going to pass in a query selector to a div that has a class of IO. And then we're going to observe this target. And what we end up getting passed in the entry is numerous different properties. In this initial first very simplistic example, we're just going to check is it intersecting? And then we're going to swap classes. It's visible or it's overflowing. Our HTML kind of looks like this, where we have an IO root, and then the actual IO, the thing that the box that we want to know whether it's intersecting or not, is right there, and then we're going to pass in some options. Initially, this totally confused me because there was a change in the specification because you used to not have to have it be a descendant. So if you happen to be using this on a browser that supports the older aspect of the specification, you may be able to put it anywhere, but technically per spec, it needs to be a descendant of the root. The margin here uses CSS margins. We're all used to CSS margins. That's what it uses, top right, bottom left. And then the threshold, you can define how often you want your callback to be called when the box is intersected. So in this case, once it's 25% intersecting, we want our callback to be called. So here's a very basic example. All I've done here is hooked up, that's that same HTML I showed you before. We've hooked up some HTML5 drag and drop, and we're changing the classes so that when it's intersecting, we're going to change it to orange, and when it's not intersecting, it's going to change it to yellow. And so you'll see it works. The important thing to remember is if we go back to the various different scenarios that we had, one important thing is to remember the pseudocode that we had before. The width is not changing. So even if we had the container queries that we all long to have right within our CSS, this solution would not be possible. In addition, imagine trying to use get-bounding client rect. You would have to, because essentially what we're doing here is collision detection. And so you would have to render not only the blue box, but match all the offsets of the yellow box on every single raft to then know when they're actually colliding. To then do the same thing, attach. The beauty of Intersection Observer is it gives us the capability of optimizing the engines remarkably. We can actually keep all of this on the compositor thread, and based on the thresholds you've given, only come back when we know that we've passed that set thresholds. This is my daughter, Rachel. I told you I would end up getting into why I have a cow and a rowboat. We've had kind of a rough year. In January, she was diagnosed with brain cancer. So I was telling her we were on this like kind of break moment. We were in between some treatments, and I was kind of telling them about this talk and how, I feel like so often, myself included, I wanted that width, and I was explaining the overflow scenario, and I was trying to explain what overflow is initially. I was like, you have a cup and you fill it up, and once it fills up too far, the water overflows. And I was like, but I don't want just like the nav example or some random boxes. I want something cute and interesting, and I had the word over, and so I was like, hey, the cow jumps over the moon. And my daughter just smashed those two together and was like, well, what if the cow is in a rowboat and the water fills up so much that the cow goes over the moon? which we both kind of giggled about, and it's totally makes sense. And then I sat there and thought about it, and I was like, we could actually make that work. We're actually showing, again, so many of us work on where we don't have control of the content, but we know the scenario that we're trying to prevent. So I contacted Emily Griffin. She's on Twitter, Emily with Curls, a wonderful illustrator, and she produced us Madeline, who I then colored in. So any of the coloring, if you are like, man, that's terrible colors, that's my fault. She gave me a black and white cow in a rowboat. And so our scenario is now this. We have a moon, and when the content forces the cow to rise a certain height, we want the cow to get excited, because to the cow's perception, it went over the moon. It fulfilled the prophecy or whatever. So I mean, it's really exciting. I mean, like, wouldn't you be excited? I'd be excited. Anyway, so what we're going to do is we're going to hack that margin. We've all hacked margins for years, right? Like, most people don't use Mutation Observer for this. Like, this isn't a scenario, but what we're doing is we're actually changing the margin to now negative 90%. So we're actually making the actual route that we're watching for intersection really small, because we know where the moon is, right? It's up in the top. And so then we're going to set our threshold. It's kind of grayed out, sorry about that. But we're setting our hash threshold for 0.15, 0.2, and 0.5. And all we're doing is changing our code here just a little bit to, rather than being overflow or visible, we're over the moon or under the moon, right? That's it. And then, so when it's done, we clear the timeout. The only reason that there's a clear timeout there is because I didn't want somebody to come back and be like, hey, Greg, you transformed this span, and that's not what we do in the real world. Somebody shoves random content in there. And so the way that the water is going to rise is I have a function that is constantly adding in variable height text of water to basically make the content push the cow up, at which point, once it intersects, the cow will be excited. So here's that working. So you'll see the words water pop in here. Come on, yeah. So again, I remember, no width's changed. No width's changed. Like, I guess that's what I really am trying to hammer home. It's like, one of the things that I want us to solve the right problems. I want us to really go after and solving the right problems and get the right use cases so that, because I really want to solve this problem. As I said, I'm really passionate about this space. But just to make things a little bit clearer, the blue box is your root box. Notice it no longer is the size of the viewport. You can make that box whatever size you want. That's what's really awesome about this. And then the intersecting root, you'll notice we didn't even get the whole cow in there. You can make that as small or as big as you want in order to fire only when you need it to fire. Let's get to a more practical example. This one is where I see kind of all over the place. This is our Outlook example, where it shrinks down. What we're going to end up doing, and this is kind of a contrived example even, because we normally don't allow people to just add nav items over and over and over again by clicking a button. But we don't care about putting content into the ... until they actually start spilling out of the navigation, right? And so that's what we're going to do. Maybe I should have made it smaller so it happened faster. Anyway, so you'll see it goes ahead and it starts adding them in there. Cool. So what we end up doing is I set the same scenario. I set the root margin to effectively be the thing, because if we're building that Outlook one, we know what we're doing. In almost every container query scenario that I've ever been a part of, people know what they're building. And so what this one is doing is it's taking into account that ... at the end. You could get fancy and say, we'll do a computed style. What's great is you could actually just put it as a custom property in your CSS right there. I actually almost considered releasing, that's why it's called, one of the things I was thinking about releasing an over-the-moon library, because so much of this, once you do it once, so many of them are so the same where you're just swapping classes of visible or not visible. But I also then hit some where they were very like specific and it wasn't, universal enough. But you can imagine this being a custom property setting, where is your root margin? And you could just adjust it there. And that's when you want the classes to change. So you can just grab them right from your JavaScript, but also have them in your CSS right where you're authoring. Anyways, we add in a threshold, an array threshold. We're checking every 25%. Let me make sure, okay, yeah. So we now are checking a new property that actually is hanging off of there that we were looking at just is intersecting in general before. But we actually get past a ratio, and it's literally to the subpixel of how much it's actually intersecting. We only care that it's less than 1, because 1 is completely visible. So the second that it isn't completely visible, we know that it's beginning to overflow. So what we do is we do a deep clone. We unobserve the current nav item that is there. We remove it from the DOM, and we append the child underneath. You can't do this in CSS. Like, it's not possible. And this is way more robust because of the fact that, for one, it's got all of your accessibility already hooked up. It allows you to actually do more powerful styling because of the fact it's now actually under the subnav. And to give you that same root node intersection observer example, we'll show the same thing, but I actually have Rex painting where the different information is. So you'll see they go in there, and you can see the root node and the actual intersection root occurring there. So here's the real world example where we have home about locate us, similar to that Outlook example. And when we resize down, everything still works exactly the same way, because all it cares about is whether or not it's intersecting. And we're just changing the classes and moving the nodes as necessary. If you flip the model on its head, this is actually where I started, because goodness gracious, you all love WebKit properties. The amount of times we've been asked for WebKit line clamp is ridiculous. And so I initially just put together a blog post. You can actually see down here using intersection observer to ellipse text. And it's a very naive use case, but essentially you could replace it with whatever JavaScript work you're doing, because you never actually want to ellipse the text until you actually need to. And so many of them actually go in and basically flush layout. Then this is where it's working against the platform. They flush layout to understand whether or not they need to ellipse text and then reinsert it into the node flushing layout again. So it's like really, really bad for performance. And we're using that same capability here. And what I'm ending up doing is I'm actually putting that the IO clash, and the code is here. I'll provide all that later. But what it's actually doing is just using block layout. And so as the text pushes the thing out, I know that it's now overflowed. Because the text, if it's short, the div is way up here, and thus it's visible. I don't need to ellipse it. Once it goes out of the box, I know it's overflowed. So it's you kind of have to change your mental model, but so many of our scenarios end up being this. Way better browser support. Safari is the only browser that is lacking here in an intersection observer. That said, there's a wonderful polyfill that falls back to that get bound and client rect scenario from before, and scroll position in order to solve this. I know it's good because we actually used it. A few colleagues and myself released the variable fonts documentation, and we used it for triggering all the scroll animations. I saw a few people talking about scrolly telling and all that other stuff. If you aren't using intersection observer to trigger those animations, I highly recommend switching to that, solely because of the fact that's actually what you want to watch when that div is in there. Because, for example, Edge, almost all of our scrolling is on a completely separate thread. You don't want to be sitting there, basically doing the scroll jacking technique to watch all the scroll positions to then determine whether or not you should fire your JavaScript. We can then keep it all on that compositor thread, bring it back to you and say, okay, what do you want to do now that you've crossed this threshold? In our case, we wanted to play a simple animation. So the pros, it allows for anything, obviously, because it's in JavaScript, it allows you to do anything. The browser support is much better. You can change content. The one negative, and literally I'm having to fight myself with this, is it's a completely different mental model that you have to wrap yourself around, because no longer are you solely caring about the width. And it just takes something, but it's once you start understanding, it kind of unlocks a lot of potential within the web platform. This one, I don't know if I'm going to get kind of in trouble for, but it's actually a very important one. I contacted this team. Sorry, I'm a slide ahead in my brain, but my boss says this all the time. I don't think he came up with it, so I'm not going to attribute it to him. I'm sure there's somebody else that did it, but if it is him, I'm sorry, Bogdan. But the most performant code is the code that isn't written. No matter what we end up doing, the best thing we can do is not write any code. And then, that's true. People want your content more than they actually want your perfect scenario setup. So I contacted this team. This is the new tab page in Microsoft Edge. You can see that it's kind of got like a Pinterest layout. They do a lot of custom layout to achieve this. They wanted kind of feedback from us on some of the performance things that they were seeing. We got in a room, kind of understand their architecture. We narrowed on one of them. It wasn't the most egregious by any means, but it was one that we thought was pretty easily fixable. And you can see that they're ellipsing this text. And ultimately, the designer may think, hey, those 3 dots look great, right? It's like very clean, it's very crisp. But what is the user experience goal? Anybody? Yes, but like the goal is for you to know that there's more there to click the title. Like that's the goal of those ellipses. And so what we ended up finding doing our tracing is that each one of these, in order to achieve these 3 dots, is 31 milliseconds of time. And so that's not a big deal if you have one of them, but if you have numerous of them, along with some of the other performance things that were going on the page, you can end up in hundreds of milliseconds, if not 300 milliseconds, if you happen to scroll down. So all we did is, I didn't come up with this, the gradient one, I'm sure you guys have seen this, where there's a gradient that is giving the same, you're telling the same thing. There's more content to be had, but we're not thrashing layout. And that's the important thing that we took away. And so we went back to them and we're like, what do the designers think? Did you have to do the 3 dots? And they were like, I don't know, like we just kind of have this universal thing and that's what it looks like. And we just said, hey, like the performance concerns, what if you went and like told them the performance numbers and showed them the potential fix? And this is now what is shipping, is the gradient. Like some definitely not designer came up with something, and this is now what's shipping because of the fact that we're not spending those 31 milliseconds. Another scenario that we ran into with another team is and this is where I think we're with the components, the web components, like our brains are so focused on that. What they ended up wanting is as it resizes down, the text area goes away, and so they were like, we need container queries in order to do this. We have to have it. And so I then, being an outsider, was like, hey, is there ever a scenario in which that component is used somewhere else? And they were like, no, this is for us. And then I said, is there ever a scenario in which the nav bar is wider than the viewport? And they said, nope, that's what it looks like. And so I was like, so you could probably figure out what is the most important things in your nav section up top, right? Like you could denote sections for something. And they said, sure. And so at that point, I was like, media queries work. We've gone full circle. It's one of those things that they were so focused on the search bar, and they said, when this thing gets this small, we want it to look a certain way. But with viewport units, we actually know the dimensionality, and we break this thing up. We know that the logo isn't going to get smashed tiny. We know that the nav bar is going to need to take up some percentage. So we actually can, at that point, use media queries in order to solve the same end result without needing to essentially try to figure out how to make container queries work. So in summary, this is the flowchart that you should follow in order to figure out what is the right thing that the platform can do today to solve your container query woes, and we'll zoom in. So I need container queries, you say. All right, have you considered another design aspect? I can't stress this enough. Jane did a great job yesterday of how we need to be collaborating more between the developer and the designer and the product manager. Is that 31 milliseconds literally the hill to die on for the site, especially if you're doing it numerous times? And they were like, no, like we don't need it. And so I think there's a lot of times where we can do that. So let's assume you've done that. Is the container you're querying always specific to the viewport, a specific percentage to the viewport? Media queries work. They work. They just work. Let's assume, no, that's not the case. Or, sorry, I went backwards. I apologize. Let's assume no. Does the query depend on its children? Let's say no. Does your container need access to the parent document? I know this is kind of like long-winded here. No, use an iframe. Again, like I said, I went ahead and included the parent document, but again, technically you can still make all that work if you have like all of your custom properties and like a separate document, all that good stuff. And again, the nav scenario is actually one that is like commonly brought up, that actually iframes almost always work because you almost always have like it's at minimum 3 rims tall, or 20% wide, or what have you. You have something segmented to that, and the iframe can just fill that, and boom, media queries now work and resolve against the iframe. Okay, let's assume none of that works out. Are you solely focused on trying to change layout? If that's the case, try to use modern grid, Flexbox, object fit, custom properties. Try to, like the calcs, I actually love that he covered responsive topography, because that was something I almost included here, but I already have too much and I'm already way too close on time, so I didn't include that. Did it work? No or yes? So no is the scenario primarily impacted by content on overflowing. So not the width changing, but what are you trying to avoid when the width gets to a certain size? If no, use Resize Observer, because you actually do care about the specific dimensionality of said box. If yes, use Intersection Observer. And finally, going back to that last point, does answering the query, is it actually important? Like, I really feel this is important. This slide I really think is very important, because sometimes I think we so focus on, well, this is what the designer gave me, I need to solve it. Every single thing you do has to prove its value in milliseconds. Every single thing. Because ultimately, that is how we need to prove our metric for success, and we need to make sure that that works. I happen to have the benefit of attending an event apart in Seattle, and Jeffrey Zellman, he has this wonderful quote. Pretty garbage. Because yeah, we saw, hey, we used Resize Observer, I don't care what paradigm in here you used. You used it, but did it actually do the thing that you wanted it to achieve? And then ultimately, you just create pretty garbage. So first, I would like to thank, again, Emily for Madeline, and my daughter for just coming up with the most adorable connection of CSS and the cow over the moon. And here's all my demos and decks. They're unnoticed. Everything is in there. Please follow me on Twitter. I'm really active there. And also, please take these, come up with different examples, because as I said, I'm still very interested in trying to come up with a declarative way to solve this, but solve the right problems. So if you come up with unique ones, please send me the code pens. I'll add them to the collection, because as we begin to iterate on those potential solutions for that use case, I want to make sure that they still work, because I can then just potentially convert them to that other way of fixing things. So thank you so much.
Come and join me in our seats. So that was another talk where I was enjoying watching Twitter and watching the sort of light bulbs go on as people are like, oh, there's so many ways you can already solve this problem, which is really cool. So yeah, and something you didn't mention, obviously you've been very involved with Houdini. Is this something that we could actually be solving with Houdini?
So that's actually a really interesting thing. Tab Atkins and I, he's one of the main spec drivers in Houdini. He works at Google. We will at some point. Resize Observer is a good example of that. But what we end up needing is we actually need custom at rules. Mm-hmm. And basically behind the hood, we'll be able to use all this same plumbing. So it is something that we could do down the road, but it's well off in the foreseeable future.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, you spoke a lot about iframes. People know what iframes are. We kind of, they sort of work in a consistent way. Why don't we mimic those just in CSS? Let the iframes content contribute to the box.
Because of the fact, so this is actually something that a few folks have looked at with the contain property. I don't know how many people have heard of contain, but basically you're saying, I know my scenario and I actually don't want you to lay out or paint or something. You're able to tell the browser to not do some work for a specific property. The problem that you end up running into with iframes is that exact same problem. So once you mimic that using the contain property, you end up not allowing the children to produce to the size of their parent, which ends up hindering a lot of the use cases for container queries, especially the card examples that we end up having. Using contain to accomplish iframes wouldn't necessarily be that complicated, because we already have iframes. We could just mimic that.
Yeah, cool. And sorry, thank you to remind people of this sort of importance of us using stuff. I've said that in several talks. People need to be using the stuff that comes out. I think there's this sort of thing of oh, well, this looks like a really cool feature, and maybe in 5 years we'll be able to use it. And yeah, the fact that people are watching to see what we're using out there.
Definitely. That's how we ended up meeting.
Meeting
about grid.
Yeah. So, you know, it is really important to actually use this stuff and play with it and feedback to,
Yes,
to
please.
us about what you're using and why and what isn't working. So thank you very much. That's been
Yeah.
such a practical and useful talk for people. So
Yes,
thank
thank
you
you so much.